I knew something was wrong the minute Dylan swaggered into the family boardroom, his brand new leather jacket flaring like a cape over his shoulders. He was 28, carrying the kind of smug confidence that comes from being the golden child, the son everyone pretends is the future. My father, our family's patriarch, clapped him on the back with a grin that said he'd won a lottery he hadn't even played. "Everyone, this is my son Dylan," he announced. "He'll be co-leading the merger discussions with Rachel." I sipped my coffee slowly, long past lukewarm, letting the bitter taste anchor me. 11 months I had spent mapping the company's deals, reconciling client risk accounts, and building the very framework Dylan now pretended to understand. I'd stayed late nights, organized the books meticulously, and ensured every contract and partnership had a failsafe. Dylan had spent those nights posting pictures on Instagram from his weekend trips, half listening to our calls, never once checking a spreadsheet. I wasn't angry yet. I'd seen this before. The golden child plopped into a system he hadn't earned, pretending to understand, paraded like a visionary while the people who did the work vanished from view. My father's eyes gleamed, proud as a man at a science fair, completely oblivious to the chaos about to unfold. "You've built a lot, Rachel," he said, "but Dylan brings a fresh perspective." Fresh perspective. The words hit like shards of ice. What my father didn't understand was that fresh perspective often meant disaster in the hands of someone who didn't know the difference between a legal clause and a Snapchat filter. Dylan grinned at me like we were friends, tossing off casual remarks about streamlining processes and shaking things up. He leaned against the conference table and twirled his pen between his fingers. "Hey, Rachel," he said, voice dripping with false camaraderie, "maybe you can walk me through your system. Show me what all the fuss is about." I nodded, keeping the calm exterior, smiling quietly while my mind catalogued every risk he could potentially create if left unchecked. The meeting continued. My father praised Dylan's leadership vision to the board members, while I quietly noted the discrepancies in his proposed strategy. He suggested cutting costs on compliance, reassigning key contracts to interns, and rebranding decades of family work into some flashy, short-term spectacle. Everyone laughed at his jokes, nodded along, but I saw it for what it was, a facade hiding incompetence and hubris. After the meeting, Dylan pulled me aside, grinning like a child who just solved a puzzle he had no right to touch. "So, Rachel, I've got some ideas for the client dashboards," he said. "Think fun, think interactive. Maybe some emoji reactions for board reports? Humanize the data." I blinked, paused, and said carefully, "Dylan, that would violate several compliance regulations. We could be liable if we do it." He shrugged, like I'd just spoken another language. Just ask Dad to chill. Rules are meant to be flexible, right?" I let my poker face stay intact, smiling politely. Flexibility comes with responsibility. You can't play fast and loose when millions of dollars are on the line. He waved my concerns off and walked away, leaving me to quietly fix the system behind his back, rolling back every reckless change, patching every hole his casual, fresh perspective had opened. And that's when it hit me. I was invisible. I had always been invisible in my father's eyes, the silent backbone of this company, the one who cleaned up after others while taking no credit. Dylan would be applauded. I would fade into memory. That night, I stayed behind, working late, quietly documenting everything. My father's golden child didn't see me. The interns didn't see me. The board certainly didn't. But I saw everything. And I knew one thing with perfect clarity. Being invisible gave me an advantage they would never suspect. I could have raged, shouted, confronted my father, and screamed at Dylan for his arrogance. But I didn't. I smiled quietly, letting the bitter truth sink in. Nepotism had stepped in front of merit, and the very system I'd built was now being paraded as his playground. And I knew, deep down, that the story was far from over. Because invisible doesn't mean powerless. and the quietest voice often carries the sharpest edge. Dylan's rise was like watching a wildfire start in a dry forest, loud, flashy, and entirely predictable. Within days of being officially co-lead on the merger, he strutted around the office as though the entire company had been waiting for his arrival. His office chair squeaked under him like it had been bought specifically for his dramatic entrances. Every junior analyst he passed gave a polite nod or smile, assuming he was untouchable. And most of the senior staff? They swallowed hard, carefully pretending everything was normal because arguing with the golden boy in your father's good graces was a battle most didn't want to fight. He wasted no time reinventing the wheel. Dylan called a meeting with me and 3 of the other managers, practically bouncing in his sneakers like he'd discovered fire. "Guys," he said, spreading his arms wide, "I've been thinking. Wave AI is fine and all, but it needs pizzazz. Think Y2K meets Burning Man, but for enterprise clients. Our dashboards, emojis, our notifications, sounds, our workflows, fun." I blinked slowly. Fun, Dylan? Fun is not a regulatory requirement. He waved his hand dismissively. Details, Rachel, details. We're here to innovate. Don't be so rigid. Rigid. That's what I was now. Rigid in the eyes of my own family, my own colleagues, because I insisted on integrity, compliance, and accuracy. He, meanwhile, was free to wave around buzzwords like confetti, pretending that creativity alone could carry a multimillion-dollar system. And the CEO? My father. He nodded approvingly. Exactly the vision we need, Dylan. Bold, fresh, unstoppable. I nodded along, sipped my coffee, and silently began cataloging the damage. Every dashboard mock-up he created violated compliance rules. Every UX redesign he demanded risked months of back-end work. And yet, everyone smiled, clapped, and encouraged his visionary ideas. Behind closed doors, Dylan's innovation translated to chaos. He wanted to scrap frameworks I had meticulously built, arguing that it feels too hierarchical. He siphoned money to outside branding firms and sound designers, all without legal approval. The back-end system began faltering under the weight of his whims. Junior engineers were on the brink of quitting, and yet no one, except me, seemed to notice or care. I kept working quietly, rolling back every reckless change. I patched the back end when he insisted on hover-activated animations that crashed browsers. I rebuilt corrupted data models he thought needed a fresh perspective. I mediated disputes between developers and designers while Dylan practiced his visionary speech in front of mirrors and TikTok cameras. At the same time, my own recognition began eroding. My name disappeared from project roadmaps. HR stopped responding to payroll questions. Team members I had mentored were reassigned to report to Dylan. My title was quietly downgraded from project lead to operations support. And every time I raised security or compliance issues, he'd smirk and say, "Rachel, you worry too much. Let's take risks to scale." But I wasn't worried, not in the way he thought. I had learned the long lesson of being underestimated. While Dylan strutted around like a peacock, I quietly built a failsafe, a hidden network of clauses, approvals, and backups. I embedded my authority deep within the compliance framework. All data transfers, licensing, or replication would require approval from the primary data certifier, me. Hidden, buried, invisible. No one would see it coming. Even as Dylan's influence expanded, his inexperience became more apparent. Contracts were mismanaged. External vendors were overspent. The team's morale was crumbling. Yet he remained untouchable in my father's eyes, praised for boldness and creativity, oblivious to the chaos he had sown. The irony! Everything he touched still relied on the systems I had built, the frameworks I had designed, the risk mitigations I had painstakingly implemented. The golden boy was climbing, and everyone was cheering, but the higher he soared, the farther he would fall. By the end of the week, I realized I had two options: confront him openly, risking a family scandal, or wait, unseen, letting his mistakes unravel the illusion. I chose the latter. Every reckless move, every misallocated vendor check, every broken workflow was a thread I could follow. I was the silent observer, the quiet strategist. And in this game, the observer often wins. Because the higher someone climbs on undeserved praise, the harder they fall, and I intended to be there when it happened. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And that's exactly how I approached Dylan's rise, the quiet, meticulous crafting of a trap he would never see coming. I didn't storm into the boardroom screaming accusations, and I didn't confront my father with tears and fury. No, I stayed invisible, working silently, letting the chaos he created paint the canvas of my opportunity. The first step was subtle. I revisited the compliance framework I had painstakingly built over the past year. Every clause, every approval flow, every licensing checkpoint, it was all there, and Dylan had no idea. He had been too busy with his innovative dashboards and emoji notifications to notice the dry, bureaucratic lines of authority I had quietly coded into the system. My title, Primary Data Certifier, was buried in the metadata like a watermark. No one ever questioned it because it was invisible, dry, unassuming. I updated a single line in the documentation. All third-party transfers of proprietary architecture require final certification from the primary data certifier. One line, innocuous, bureaucratic, and almost laughably subtle. But it was the linchpin. Without that certification, nothing could move. Any attempt to license, export, or transfer proprietary IP would hit a dead end. Dylan could spend millions, redesign everything, rewrite contracts, and it wouldn't matter. He couldn't legally do a thing without me. Meanwhile, he continued his reckless spree. I watched from my quiet corner as he poured money into neon mock-ups and experimental UI designs. He authorized $160,000 for a sound designer who claimed ambient chimes would enhance emotional engagement. He funneled $500,000 into a vaporware pilot demo, all without legal sign-off. Everyone around him applauded, nodding like trained seals. My father beamed, the board smiled, the interns recorded TikToks. They were all blind to the avalanche waiting at their feet. Behind the scenes, I repaired every broken system he touched. I rebuilt corrupted data pipelines, rerouted dependencies, and patched models that wouldn't function under his visionary redesigns. Every repair I made was invisible, silent, no congratulations, no recognition. Just the satisfaction of knowing that when the house of cards fell, the foundation was still mine. And then the isolation began. My emails were ignored. Calendar invites disappeared. My security credentials were quietly downgraded. Dylan referred to me as legacy ops during meetings, as though I were already a relic of the past. It would have been humiliating if I had let it be. But I didn't. Because humiliation doesn't matter when you're invisible. It's the quiet ones who are underestimated who have the real power. I started mapping out the timeline, the trail of errors, the misappropriated funds, the broken vendor agreements. Every slip Dylan made, every reckless decision, became a thread in my web. I documented it meticulously, backed it up in multiple locations, with timestamps and screenshots. One folder went to a cloud repository, another to a secure hard drive, a third hidden away in a personal encrypted drive. If anyone tried to challenge me later, there would be no dispute, only the unflinching, documented truth. By the time Dylan realized the damage he had caused, it would be too late. He would be caught in his own hubris. I was patient, methodical, deliberate. I did not seek drama or confrontation. I sought leverage. Because leverage isn't flashy, it's quiet, precise, and almost surgical. Weeks passed. The company continued to celebrate Dylan's leadership. Contracts were signed, invoices processed, pilots launched, but every time a system touched my clauses, it required my certification. And no one, not Dylan, not my father, not HR, could bypass it. I watched from the sidelines as frustration grew among the staff. Internal emails flew back and forth. Meetings grew tense. Something was wrong, and no one could figure it out. And that was the point. The quiet revenge wasn't about anger. It wasn't about confrontation or spectacle. It was about control. I didn't need to yell or storm offices. I simply created the conditions where Dylan's own arrogance would trigger the checks I had put in place. The higher he climbed, the more dependent he became on me, completely unaware that the system would not function without my approval. I smiled quietly to myself one night as I reviewed the logs. Every reckless move, every overpaid vendor, every flashy redesign, it all fed into my trap. And when the day came that the board needed a legally recognized certifier to proceed, they would have to come to me. Not in apology, not in flattery, not in begging. They would come because they had no choice. Revenge doesn't have to be loud. It just has to work. And mine, meticulously planned, buried in bureaucratic invisibility, was about to. The day of reckoning came quietly, like a storm rolling in without warning. No alarms, no confrontations, just a single email from Danica in legal, flagged urgent, subject line, Wave AI licensing compliance review. My pulse ticked upward, but my expression remained calm. Years in tech and corporate bureaucracy teach you that panic is a luxury reserved for the unprepared. I had prepared for this moment meticulously. The email contained everything I needed: an audit trail showing the current licensing workflow, vendor contracts, and, most importantly, a detailed report on external transfer requests. Dylan's colorful dashboards, his $500,000 vaporware stunt, the sound designer, the freelance branding lab, all of it was documented. Every overstep, every procedural violation, every unauthorized expenditure had been logged. And at the bottom of the audit, flashing like a silent warning, was the clause I had buried months ago: all external transfers of proprietary architecture require final certification from the primary data certifier. That was me. I leaned back in my chair and let it sink in. For weeks, Dylan had strutted around as if he were the captain of a ship he had no idea how to steer. He had spent the company's money on frivolous designs, abandoned frameworks, and extravagant pitches, all while the backbone of the system rested entirely on what I had built and what I alone could authorize. The first cracks appeared subtly. The board convened an emergency meeting, not public, not flashy, just a quiet whisper in the corridors. We need the certification cleared. Huawei licensing is stalled. The CEO tried to spin it, smiling and pointing at charts showing progress that didn't exist. Investors nodded politely, unaware of the silent trap waiting to be triggered. And Dylan. He looked increasingly uncomfortable, flipping through documents as though sheer visibility of text might somehow undo reality. Danica spoke first. We have a compliance flag. Clause 7.4 has been triggered. Any licensing without the original certifier's authorization is void. Current status: frozen. A hush fell over the room. Dylan's confident grin faltered. The CEO's eyes widened slightly, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He hadn't considered the clause in months of glowing presentations. He hadn't read the fine print. He hadn't noticed that in his rush to highlight his son's visionary leadership, he had bypassed the one person who could legally unlock the system. Board members shifted in their seats, whispering, nudging each other. "Who's the certifier?" asked one investor, voice cautious. "I thought she was terminated." Silence. I stayed out of sight at first, letting the tension settle. They didn't know that I was watching from the shadows, reviewing logs, preparing for the moment when the system's reliance on me would be undeniable. When they realized that the $8.4 million poured into development and launch efforts couldn't legally move forward, they would have to confront the one person who had been quietly controlling the levers all along. The CEO finally broke the silence, his voice tight. "We need to. Can we override this? IT should be able to." Danica shook her head. "Not without certification from the primary data certifier. Clause 7.4 is active. The certification cannot be bypassed. System and licensing are frozen." Dylan's face drained of color. He had built nothing of real legal or technical significance without my architecture underpinning it. Every extravagant mock-up, every flashy pitch, every press-ready video showcasing his leadership depended on me. And now, he realized, he couldn't move a single piece forward without the person he and the CEO had tried to erase. I made my entrance quietly, 10 minutes later, not as a hero, not as a savior, but as the gatekeeper. The room collectively stiffened, a subtle electricity in the air. All eyes turned to me. The CEO's jaw tightened. Dylan's hands fidgeted. Investors leaned forward, as if the woman who had been absent for weeks could suddenly wield the power to stop their projected revenue in its tracks. I placed the folder containing the compliance logs and clauses on the table, the weight of it enough to fill the room with an almost tangible gravity. My voice was calm, precise. The system cannot proceed without primary certification. All external licensing is frozen until approval is granted by the original data certifier. That person is me. I was never removed from this role, and any attempt to bypass this clause violates the agreements approved by this board last year. The room went silent, a collective exhale held hostage by shock. Dylan stammered. What we... I cut him off with a glance sharp enough to silence him completely. "No, Dylan, not yet." And just like that, the Golden Boy's empire of hype, cash, and TikTok charisma collapsed in slow motion. The board members realized the weight of every reckless decision they had applauded. The CEO understood, in an instant, that the person they had attempted to erase controlled everything. The quiet revenge was complete. Not with noise, not with chaos, but with unshakable authority. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't gloat. I simply sat, calm, precise, indispensable. And in that moment, the room understood something fundamental. The future wasn't in Dylan's flashy hands, it was in mine. The next morning felt like stepping onto the deck of a sinking ship, though nobody else realized it yet. Dylan arrived at the office with his usual swagger, oversized hoodie draped like a cape, earbuds in, phone in hand, still expecting the world to bend around his performance art of leadership. But something had shifted. The invisible scaffolding he had taken for granted, the systems I built, the compliance protocols I maintained, the legal approvals quietly resting in my name, had become a silent barricade. He didn't see it coming, and he wouldn't see it until it was too late. His first sign of trouble came from IT. Marcus, the ever-vigilant systems architect, approached him cautiously. "Dylan, there's a flag on your admin account. You don't have permissions to push external licensing packages." Dylan laughed nervously, waving it off like a minor inconvenience. "What? That's impossible. I'm leading this rollout." I know," Marcus interrupted, voice low but firm, "but it's tied to Clause 7.4. Only Sarah can authorize transfers. Without her certification, nothing can go live." Dylan froze, eyebrows knitting together. "Clause 7.4? Sarah. She's gone. I thought we..." "I know what you thought," Marcus said, "but the clause was never removed. And IT doesn't override legal mandates. That's not how compliance works." His face paled. He turned to the CEO, who had been trying to maintain composure during a hastily arranged meeting in the corner office. The usually confident, stock photo-ready man of the hour now fumbled with his notes, struggling to explain why the person they fired held all the keys. He tried to wave it off as a technical hiccup, as if bureaucratic inertia could mask their missteps. Dylan's flailing gestures didn't help. He had no plan, no backup, no understanding of the quiet architecture of power he had ignored. Emails started pinging in faster than anyone could read them. Vendors reporting stalled invoices, auditors questioning transfers, clients demanding updates that couldn't legally be provided. Every attempt Dylan made to salvage control only dug the hole deeper. The branding lab he had hired for his aesthetic whims? Their accounts were frozen pending approvals. The sound designer? Contracted payments were on hold. Every flashy expense became a chain around his ankle, each missed certification a nail in the coffin of his self-proclaimed genius. The board was alerted. Investors who had been swept away by the spectacle of a flashy AI launch began asking hard questions. Who is the primary certifier? Why is licensing frozen? Why were we told the rollout was ready? Questions flew like arrows. Dylan stammered, faltered, and finally admitted he didn't have the credentials, didn't have the authority, didn't understand the rules. He had built castles of sand on the foundation I had laid, and the tide had come in. I watched from the shadows, calm. My revenge had never been about public humiliation. It had always been about inevitability. Dylan's collapse wasn't a spectacle for me. It was an unfolding fact of the systems I had quietly controlled. He couldn't fake his way out of a process he had ignored, a contract he hadn't read, a network of approvals he hadn't respected. By noon, the office had transformed into a theater of chaos. The CEO's voice was tight, strained, as he tried to spin the narrative. We're just reconfiguring internal workflows, temporary setback, but the room didn't buy it. Each investor and executive had discovered the truth. The golden boy with his $600 hoodies, TikTok following, and vaporware pitches was powerless. The product he had been credited with leading was literally frozen until the rightful authority, me, gave clearance. Dylan slumped into his chair, sweat glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. His confident aura had evaporated. Calls went unanswered. Emails bounced. The vendors, the PR teams, the client demos, they all stopped in their tracks. Every dollar he had mismanaged now weighed like a boulder on the ceiling, ready to crush him. And in that moment, I realized that power isn't always loud. It doesn't need social media posts or self-congratulatory boardroom speeches. True authority is structural, procedural, and invisible until the moment it isn't. Dylan had been spectacularly visible, yet completely hollow. His collapse wasn't dramatic. It was surgical, precise, inevitable. By evening, the news had spread. Wave AI rollout delayed indefinitely, read the press release drafted quietly by legal and operations. Investors demanded meetings, the CEO scrambled, and Dylan disappeared into the background, an embarrassed footnote in a story he thought he controlled. The golden boy had crumbled under the weight of the one clause he never noticed, the one professional who had been underestimated, erased, and overlooked, me. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself a small, private smile. It wasn't gloating. It wasn't revenge. It was satisfaction, the quiet, unshakable kind that comes from knowing that no matter how flashy or loud the world gets, competence, preparation, and integrity will always have the final word. The air in the boardroom was heavy, almost electric, the day after Dylan's spectacular collapse. I arrived quietly, but with intention. No fanfare, no dramatic entrance, just the calm, measured steps of someone who had been underestimated for far too long. My black blouse was crisp, sleeves rolled just slightly, a leather folder tucked under my arm, the weight of preparation tangible in every movement. Today wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming control, about restoring order to a system they had thought they could run without me. As I stepped through the glass doors, all eyes turned, and the CEO's face fell into an awkward mixture of surprise and unease. He had tried to play the confident leader yesterday, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. Investors murmured among themselves, some checking tablets, others leaning forward in their chairs, sensing the shift in dynamics. Dylan was nowhere in sight. Not on the floor, not in the conference hall, not even responding to frantic messages. The absence of the golden boy was itself a statement, one he hadn't prepared for. I opened my folder and placed it on the polished table with deliberate precision. Inside were organized logs, screenshots, timestamps, and correspondence, documenting every misstep, every unauthorized change Dylan had attempted, and every compliance protocol I had quietly maintained. At the top, the clause that mattered, 7.4. The contract freeze that had paralyzed the rollout until my certification was granted. It wasn't a weapon, not really. It was a safeguard, a reminder that competence and foresight are worth far more than flashy presentations or superficial titles. The legal team had already briefed the board. Danica, poised but tense, nodded toward me, acknowledging the pivotal role I had played, the one they had all ignored for too long. I began, calm, authoritative, and deliberate. Before we discuss next steps, I want to clarify the status of the Wave AI rollout. As of this moment, no client deployment can proceed without final certification from the primary data certifier. That certifier is me. All other approvals are irrelevant without compliance verification. The room was silent, each executive processing the weight of my words. The CEO's confident cadence faltered. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Dylan's absence was a faint echo in the air, a reminder that performance alone cannot substitute for expertise. I continued, presenting a clear, step-by-step plan to restore integrity, streamline licensing, and realign client expectations. No theatrics, no excuses, just solutions. This is not a punitive measure, I said, meeting the eyes of investors, legal counsel, and executives alike. It is a procedural necessity. The architecture, the compliance protocols, and the IP are intact, but they require the proper authority to move forward. I am here to ensure the product we've built is protected, functional, and ready for deployment under full legal and operational compliance. For the first time in months, I felt the room shift. The invisible weight I had carried, the constant work, the unacknowledged late nights, the meticulous attention to details, was now tangible. Recognition doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes as quiet acknowledgement, as board members leaning in, taking notes, finally understanding the architecture of authority, and realizing the risk of dismissing someone who was indispensable. By the end of the session, decisions were being made, but this time with clarity, deliberation, and respect for the structures I had built. Dylan's name was barely mentioned. His missteps were acknowledged, but the focus was forward-looking. Systems were locked until proper certification could be issued, clients were informed with transparent communication, and the company regained footing without the chaos that had threatened to derail months of work. I left the boardroom later that evening, not victorious in the theatrical sense, but triumphant in the way only true mastery allows. There was no need for revenge or vindication. The system, the contracts, and the work I had done spoke louder than any Instagram post or TikTok pitch. Walking through the quiet office, empty now after a day of recalibration, I allowed myself a small smile. I had been invisible, underestimated, and dismissed, but never irrelevant. That night, I sat in my apartment, a glass of wine in hand, the city lights reflecting softly against the window. I thought of every late-night debugging session, every careful compliance check, every silent moment of preparation while others claimed the spotlight. I realized something profound. Empowerment isn't about shouting the loudest or firing the flashiest emails. It's about understanding your own value, maintaining integrity, and acting with precision when the moment calls for it. Dylan had been flashy, impulsive, and loud, but he lacked the foundation, the quiet expertise, the patience, the foresight that true leadership requires. The CEO, the board, and the investors had learned it the hard way. And me. I had finally stepped out of the shadows without needing permission, without dramatics, and without compromise. Empowerment, I realized, is both quiet and absolute. It doesn't demand attention, it earns it. It doesn't require applause, it produces results. And as I poured the last sip of wine, I knew one thing. The future belonged to those who prepared, persevered, and never allowed their work to be erased. I had been the backbone of Wave AI all along, and now everyone else finally understood that truth.